Captain Midnight.
This video is brought to you by Trade Coffee. So, despite all the controversy surrounding the current ASM run, this is shaping up to be a pretty great year to be a Spider-Man fan. Between Across the Spider-Verse and Spider-Man 2, and maybe I'm being a little optimistic, assuming that it won't get delayed out of 2023, but either way, what Insomniac just showed off at the recent PlayStation event was exactly the long gameplay reveal that I'd been looking forward to, and I just knew I wanted to make a video about it. Not just to discuss where the series seems to be improving and changing, but maybe also riff a little bit on what I'd like to see from this one. Which might seem weird. I know I don't cover video games very much, really just a handful of times in the entire history of the channel, but I've always made a special exception for Spider-Man. If you'd like to see me cover games more often, liking this video and sharing it somewhere would definitely go a long way, or just let me know down in the comments.
You're just too clever for me, JJ.
There he is, officers! Shoot him now! Shoot him!
So that recent state of play seemed to garner a pretty tepid response online. I think I was actually a little more positive on it than many people I've seen, mostly because a lot of the indie games I was actually pretty excited about, like Revenant Hill. But it seemed like most could agree that Spider-Man 2 was a real bright spot closing out the show. The presentation begins with the reveal of Kraven the Hunter, and it looks like Insomniac is actually going with a pretty traditional version of Kraven here. I feel like this is a character that's kind of easy to overthink for some writers, just because they're so afraid of him coming off as too 60s and goofy. Like, I'm a pretty big fan of that original Ultimate Spider-Man comic run, but I've always thought that making Kraven the star of a reality show was a terrible idea, and one that they unfortunately carried over into the not very good 2017 animated series. We don't get any hint of that here, and I'm really hoping it stays that way. Kraven's primal drive to be the ultimate predator, especially as explored in Kraven's Last Hunt, is just so much more interesting to me than reality TV fame being part of the equation. They seem to have gone with a fairly straightforward interpretation of Sergei, and I think that was probably a smart move, especially since Kraven isn't a character that we've seen done in movies already. Well, okay, not until this fall anyway, but who knows what that Sony solo film is going to end up looking like. We then move to Queens. It's not a big surprise that Queens is in this game. After the first game only had Manhattan, and Miles Morales added Brooklyn. Queens is Peter's childhood home, and it feels like the natural next step. And with that shot focusing on the football field, it immediately reminded me of the cel-shaded Ultimate Spider-Man PS2 game where I ran around in Queens endlessly, especially on that field where you fought Venom. Which isn't important really, but I appreciated it. Kinda speaking of Venom, the black suit, it's here. And unlike Peter's signature suit in the first game that really changed things up, they definitely went the more traditional route, keeping the classic 80s design. I will say though that they went out of their way to make it look organic, with this kind of gross and rough skin-like texture to it, which I do really like. It really makes the symbiote feel like a living organism, not just a costume with special powers. But those powers, they look really fun. Sorry to just go full fanboy in this little section here, but this showcases so many cool new abilities. Borrowing a lot of what I liked in Web of Shadows and Ultimate Spider-Man and really taking it up several notches. I also like that it farther differentiates Peter and Miles' power sets, which seems super important in a game where you can switch between them. I also like that even Peter's regular non-symbiote moves take on a more brutal style, like his rapid kicks here. Peter is obviously being affected by the suit in this game, and we get a more intense and angry performance from Yuri Lowenthal. Now, when I first saw that this was an aspect of it, I was a little mixed, honestly, just because I've seen and read the basic Black Suit storyline so many times at this point, and the basics are almost always the same. Peter gets the suit, becomes intoxicated with its power, the symbiote influences his mind, causing him to be a huge jerk who alienates all of his friends. He hits rock bottom and finally gets rid of it at a church with a giant bell. It is really funny that the original ASM comic book storyline doesn't actually have Peter becoming emotionally impacted by the creature at all. Like, mostly he's just mad that it's taking his body for robotic joyrides at night. But ever since the 90s cartoon, this version of events has more or less become cemented as the way the story has been told, and it has been told so many times. So what, if anything, makes it seem like it could be different here? Well, for one thing, the fact that Miles will have a front row seat to Peter Parker's meltdown. I wouldn't be surprised to see this lead to a boss fight against Peter, which I actually feel like could be pretty bold and interesting, especially after all these hours the series has already devoted to their friendship. And I don't think the twists on the Black Suit story will stop there. The end of the first game had Harry Osborn being kept alive by the symbiote, and I'm guessing that however Peter ends up with it will involve Harry, at least in some way. This would give the origin of the symbiote a personal connection to Spider-Man that could be interesting and add a lot of weight to Peter's descent into anger and rage here. How the symbiote gets introduced in these stories is always kind of fascinating to me, just because almost no adaptation can go with the original origin of Spidey basically getting it from a costume dispenser on Battleworld. Raimi's Spider-Man 3 takes, in my opinion, a pretty lazy approach, with it just kind of falling from space. Whereas Spectacular Spider-Man pulls it off pretty elegantly, tying it into the disintegration of Eddie and Peter's friendship. I can't wait to see how this game handles it, because honestly I just love comparing this stuff. Anyway, I know I still need to talk about the Lizard, but come on, we have to address the elephant in the room here. The big guy who didn't show up in this presentation but was in the initial trailer, Venom. My guess, and of course it is just a guess, is that Kraven and the Lizard are the villains you're dealing with in like the first half or 2/3 of the game, and Venom is the big bad you have to deal with after Peter has ditched the black suit. That's not really based on anything more than the fact that, I mean, let's be honest, Venom is just higher on the Spider-Man villain totem pole than those two. I guess they're making us wait and see how he's going to be used here. I am really curious to see if this Venom is going to be Harry Osborn himself. Which does feel like what Miles Morales' post-credit scene was kind of hinting at. That would be pretty strange, and at first blush, I'm not a huge fan of the idea, but this team has earned my trust at this point, so I'm definitely willing to give it a chance. That Miles Morales post-credit scene also gave us our first barely visible glimpse at Curt Connors, who is set up to be a major factor here as the Lizard. And alright, sure. Godzilla Mendoza made a great video a few years ago about how hard the Lizard is to use effectively, and I would agree. Honestly, I'm just tired of this guy. The idea that he's getting bigger and bigger as he sheds his skin is kinda cool and lends itself to a video game, but Curt Connors is just not a character I was dying to see in these games. And the design of the Lizard here doesn't do much for me either, coming off more like a generic game boss than anything else. It's not a big deal, and I'm sure it'll lead to some great set pieces like the one we see here, but I hope the game reaches a little deeper into the Rogues Gallery too. A more surprising pull would be really welcome. Personally, I nominate Will-O-the-Wisp. I know he's got a goofy name and is pretty obscure, popping up here and there since the late 70s, but he's got a power set that would lend itself to video games, and his origin is tied into working at Roxxon. Maybe here he could be a more Miles-centric villain. I mean, why not go for some deeper cuts when it worked out really well the first time around with Mr. Negative? Anyway, I've also heard some criticism that the game just looks too similar to the last two, which I sort of understand, I guess, but all the changes we've seen so far, from the symbiote powers to Miles' new ability to shoot web lines to walk on, seem like exactly the kind of new additions that a smart sequel makes. One thing I would really like to see more from though is the open world. This is one area where I feel like there's a lot of room to improve. Now the open world in the first two is fantastic for web swinging and exploring the rooftops, but the ground was usually pretty dull and kind of cardboard. I'd love to see some new ways to interact with the people of New York. But much more importantly, I need there to be more variety of the kind of crimes that pop up. Stopping a moving car was really cool the first 3 times. It was a lot less welcome on the 300th time. I know these are just side activities, but they make up a huge portion of the moment-to-moment gameplay, and I really hope there's been a big overhaul or at least expansion of this kind of stuff. I love going back to those games and just swinging around for fun, but it got to the point where actually stopping crime was kind of boring and I didn't really bother doing it anymore. Which, sorry Uncle Ben. At the end of the day though, this presentation was basically everything I hoped it would be. The game appears to be building on all the best elements of the last two, and I think the story has a lot of potential as well. While the humor and quips in these doesn't always land for me, which to be fair is pretty par for the course with Spider-Man, that first game managed to tell a moving, impactful, and oftentimes surprising story with Peter Parker. While the gameplay took everything I loved about the PS2 and PS3 era Spider-Man games and really polished it up into a big budget AAA level package. It's an incredibly solid foundation to build on, and I trust Insomniac to do just that. Like I said, being able to switch between Miles and Peter seems like it's going to be a massive game changer. And speaking of massive game changers, let's talk about one with coffee. So I drink a lot of coffee, and honestly, the stuff I made at home tended to be pretty boring big brands that I didn't have really strong feelings about. And that's where Trade Coffee comes in. Trade is a coffee service that makes it simple to discover new coffees from over 55 top indie roasters, enabling you to make your best cup of coffee at home every day. Whatever your taste happens to be, Trade curates it just for you. I've had 3 of their signature red bags show up at my door now, and it has been really great getting to try out brands that weren't even on my radar before. Here I had a dark roast that was really subtly sweet and a little chocolatey too. Really became a fast favorite. Plus, Trade is super hassle-free, with free shipping, anytime cancellation, and fully customizable plans. So upgrade your morning routine with better coffee. Right now, Trade is offering my viewers a free bag of coffee with any subscription at drinktrade.com/CaptainMidnight. That's drinktrade.com/CaptainMidnight for a free bag of coffee with any subscription purchase. drinktrade.com/CaptainMidnight.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes too.